It was the middle of January, and the ballroom was full when the old woman stood up. 120 guests had come out to that lakeside estate in Lake Forest, north of Chicago, to watch Dante Ferraro announce his engagement. Men who ran ports and construction unions, lawyers, politicians, the kind of people who don't get invited anywhere twice. At 37, Ferraro was the kind of man who could make a room go quiet just by walking into it. Beside him stood his bride-to-be, 31, beautiful, wealthy, smiling for the cameras. And at the head table sat his mother, Rosalind, 71 years old, a woman who some mornings couldn't remember what year it was. Everybody in that room had been told to keep an eye on her that night. Nobody thought to look at the young woman carrying the tray. She was 27, a maid, in a uniform that wasn't hers, and she'd spent 7 months in that house learning that the safest thing a person could be was invisible. So when Ferraro raised his glass, she kept her eyes down, and she kept moving. Then his mother pushed back her chair. She stepped away from the head table. She walked past the senators, past the lawyers, past her own son, and she stopped in the middle of that ballroom, in front of the girl with the tray, and she started to cry. "I want her," Rosalind said, loud enough for every single guest to hear it. "I want her as my daughter-in-law." The tray hit the floor. 120 people turned at once. The bride's smile cracked straight down the middle. And Dante Ferraro, a man who had never once been caught off guard in his life, stood up on that stage and didn't say a word, because he was staring at his mother's hands, gripping the sleeve of a maid's uniform like it was the only real thing left in the room, and because somewhere behind his ribs, something had just gone very cold. His mother forgot names. She forgot faces. She'd forgotten her own son twice that year, so why hadn't she ever, not one single time, forgotten this girl? If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and share it with somebody who'd want to hear it tonight. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. It really does help us keep these stories coming. Now let's go back 7 months, to the night a woman with nothing walked through those gates for the very first time. 7 months earlier, on an afternoon in the middle of June, Elena Novak was kneeling on the 4th-floor hallway of an office building in Avondale, wiping up a coffee stain someone had left there 3 hours earlier, without even bothering to pick up the paper cup. She had been there since 6 o'clock that morning. At 7 that evening, she would catch the number 56 bus in time for her night shift at the laundromat on Belmont Street, where she stood folding hotel sheets until 2 o'clock in the morning, then returned to the one-bedroom apartment, slept for 4 hours, and began all over again. She had lived that way for 6 months, ever since the funeral. It wasn't because she didn't understand that she was destroying her own health. She understood it perfectly. She had completed 3 years of nursing school at a public college in the city, and she could still remember the entire chapter about the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation on the nervous system. She simply had no other choice. Her phone vibrated in her apron pocket as she wrung out the rag. She looked at the name on the screen and let it ring twice more before answering, because she already knew what the call would be about. The man on the other end was a hospital debt collector, his voice polite in the practiced way of someone reciting words he had memorized, and he repeated the figure Elena knew so well that it no longer sounded like a number. It sounded like a name, $190,000. She asked the same question she had asked 4 times in 4 months, whether there was any financial assistance program she hadn't applied for, and he gave her the same answer he had given 4 times, that those programs were for patients, and she wasn't the patient. She was the co-signer. That was where everything always stopped. 4 years earlier, when her mother was first admitted to the hospital, and someone slid the papers across the admissions counter, Elena was 23 years old, and wearing her nursing student coat, and no one explained that the signature on the second line wasn't a mere administrative formality. It was a personal promise that if the patient couldn't pay, she would. She signed because her mother was gasping for breath on a gurney about 10 feet away, and they told her that if she didn't sign, the admission process would be delayed. A year later, when the disease progressed to the point that she couldn't stay in school and care for her mother at the same time, she guaranteed her mother's placement in a memory care facility on the west side of the city, and she signed again. Then she withdrew from the spring semester of her 3rd year, telling herself she would return after 1 year. She never did. Early onset Alzheimer's didn't give anyone a year. It took everything one piece at a time, in an order no one could predict. And the cruelest part wasn't the nights when her mother called her by the name of an old classmate who had died long ago. The cruelest part was the afternoons when her mother was still completely lucid and knew she was slowly losing herself, when she held her daughter's hand and apologized for becoming a burden. Elena had learned to tell her there was no burden at all, and she had said it so many times that she no longer knew which of them she was trying to comfort. The call ended with a promise that they would contact her again the following week. Elena slipped the phone back into her pocket, finished wiping up the coffee stain, then sat down on the emergency stairwell and opened the envelope she had tucked into her backpack that morning and deliberately avoided opening. Inside was the fall tuition notice from the community college where Tomas was in his second year. Her younger brother was 19 and studying engineering, and for the past 6 months, he had quietly taken on extra shifts at an auto parts store without telling her. Elena had discovered it only when she saw his uniform hanging over a chair to dry. She had stood frozen for a long while, not because she was angry, but because she understood that if things continued this way, he would drop out by the following spring, and then he would work 3 jobs at once, just as their father had done years ago, and the circle would close exactly as it had for the generation before them. She folded the notice, put it back into her backpack, and at that exact moment, her phone vibrated a second time. This time it was the staffing agency where she had submitted an application in April and nearly forgotten about. The woman on the other end spoke plainly and without preamble. A family in Lake Forest needed a resident caregiver for an elderly woman with dementia, along with some household duties. The position required living on the property 6 days a week, with a private room provided. Elena asked about the salary, and the woman named a figure that made her ask to hear it again. It was roughly 4 times the total income Elena currently earned from both of her jobs combined. She remained silent long enough for the woman to add that there were certain conditions. The applicant would have to sign a confidentiality agreement. She couldn't tell anyone where she worked. She couldn't bring friends or relatives to the house. And there was one final condition that the agent read in the same even voice, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The applicant wasn't permitted to ask any questions about the family's business dealings. Elena asked why. The woman on the other end was silent for exactly 2 seconds, then said that if Elena needed to ask that question, perhaps the position wasn't right for her. Elena looked down at her hands, at the fingers cracked from cleaning chemicals, then thought of the figure 190,000, and then of the auto parts store uniform hanging over the chair. She said she would take the job. 2 days later, in a small office in the Loop, she signed 4 documents she had only enough time to skim, and one that she read carefully. The one stating that any breach of confidentiality would result in immediate termination. She signed on the final line beside the name Novak, and no one in that room appeared to know what that name meant. The staffing agency's car dropped her off outside the gate at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and the first thing Elena noticed was that the gate didn't open automatically. There were 2 men inside the guard booth. One stepped out and asked for her name, while the other remained where he was, never taking his eyes off the canvas bag she was carrying. The first man spoke into his radio, read her name to someone on the other end, waited for confirmation, and only then pressed the button. The gate slowly slid aside. Elena walked in along the gravel drive, and on the way she counted 3 cars parked along the edge of the lot. All 3 were dark-colored, and none of them had license plates. She didn't stop to look. Years of working in other people's homes had taught her that the most dangerous thing in an unfamiliar house wasn't what you saw, but letting people see that you were looking. The woman who met her at the side entrance was about 58 years old, with her hair gathered into a neat bun and a clipboard in her hands. She introduced herself as Margaret Hale, the family's housekeeper, and she didn't offer to shake hands. She merely looked Elena over from head to toe once, then said she would read the rules one time and expected never to have to repeat them. Elena set her bag at her feet and said she was listening. First, whenever there were guests in the house, members of the staff weren't permitted to initiate conversation with them. No greetings, no pleasantries, no answering questions of any kind except to give directions to the restroom. If a guest spoke to her, she was to lower her head and keep walking. Second, the entire east wing of the house, including the study and the 2 adjoining rooms, was off limits. She wasn't to clean there, bring food there, or knock on any of the doors. If the owner needed anything from that part of the house, he would come out and get it himself. Third, and Margaret paused here, lowering the clipboard so she could look directly into Elena's face. Personal phones weren't allowed on the 2nd floor. They weren't to be kept in a pocket or set to silent. They were to be left behind. There was a locked cabinet at the foot of the stairs for that purpose. Elena asked whether she would be allowed to use her phone during her breaks, and Margaret said yes, on the ground floor or outside in the yard, wherever she wished, but never on the 2nd floor. There were no exceptions, even in an emergency. If there was an emergency, she was to use the landline in the kitchen, and Margaret pointed toward the telephone mounted on the wall beside the pantry door. Elena followed the direction of her hand and committed its location to memory, never knowing that 7 months later, that telephone would be the only thing standing between an old woman and something terrible. Fourth, Margaret continued, and this was the most important rule. Elena wasn't to ask questions. She wasn't to ask who had just arrived, who had just left, why someone had stayed overnight, or why there were noises at 3 o'clock in the morning. If she heard anything while she was working, she was to behave as though she hadn't heard it. If she saw anything, she was to behave as though she hadn't seen it. Elena asked only one question. If the elderly woman needed to be taken to a doctor, whom should she notify? Margaret nodded as though that were the first correct question Elena had asked, then said Elena was to report it to her, and only to her. Afterward, she took Elena on a tour of the house. As they walked, Elena counted a camera at the end of every hallway, including the corridor leading to the laundry room and the passage between the kitchen and the pantry. There were no cameras in the elderly woman's private room. That, Elena thought, was at least one small act of decency. She didn't ask why a house needed so many cameras. She didn't ask why the 3 cars outside had no license plates, or why the 2 men at the gate were wearing heavy coats in the middle of June. She merely noticed these things, arranged them together in her mind, and understood that whatever this family did, it wasn't the sort of thing recorded in their tax filings. Then she thought of the figure 190,000, and she kept walking behind Margaret. They were passing through the main hallway, just as a man emerged from the east wing. Margaret stopped immediately and stepped back half a pace, and Elena followed her example without having to be told. The man was about 37 years old. He was holding a phone but wasn't speaking into it, and he stopped when he saw a stranger in the house. Margaret said this was the new caregiver. He didn't ask Elena's name. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Elena had the unmistakable feeling that she had been read from beginning to end like a page on a desk. Then he turned away and continued toward the stairs without saying a word, nodding, or offering a greeting. Margaret waited until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded before continuing in the same even voice, saying that he was Mr. Ferraro and that Elena would rarely need to speak to him. That afternoon, as Elena carried her bag upstairs to her room in the servants' quarters, she encountered a younger man at the foot of the stairs, about 29 years old, who appeared to be waiting for someone. He saw her struggling with the bag and the door, stepped forward to hold the door open for her, then told her there was freshly brewed coffee in the kitchen all day. No one charged for it, and if she ever lost her way, she could ask him. His name was Nico. It was the first kind thing anyone had said to Elena since she walked through that gate. She thanked him, closed the door to her room, sat down on the edge of the bed, and began counting backward through the number of months she needed to endure there. Margaret took her upstairs at 4 o'clock that afternoon and stopped before the last door at the end of the hallway. Then she told Elena something she had deliberately saved until the final moment. Mrs. Ferraro had dismissed 4 caregivers in the past 10 months, and the one who had lasted the longest had stayed 13 days. Elena asked why they had been dismissed. Margaret said she didn't know, because Mrs. Ferraro never gave a reason. She simply looked at a person for a moment, told them to leave, and never changed her mind. Then Margaret knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for an answer. The woman sitting in the armchair beside the window was 71 years old, with her back straight and her hands resting on the arms of the chair, and she turned her head before Margaret had time to say anything. She looked Elena over from head to toe in exactly the same way her son had looked at her in the main hallway that morning, then told her to get out. Margaret began explaining that Elena was the new caregiver and that she had qualifications, but Mrs. Ferraro cut her off, saying she hadn't asked what qualifications the girl had. She had told her to get out. Margaret turned toward Elena with the expression of someone who had already witnessed this scene 4 times. Elena didn't move. She didn't smile, soften her voice, or step closer. She simply stood in the doorway and said that yes, she would leave, but she would sit in the hallway, and if Mrs. Ferraro needed anything, she could call for her. Then she did leave. She closed the door, pulled out the wooden chair in the hallway, and sat down. Margaret watched her for a long moment, then went back downstairs. Elena sat there for 4 hours. She didn't knock on the door even once. At 8 o'clock that evening, the door opened, and Mrs. Ferraro stood there with one hand braced against the frame, asking what Elena was doing there. Elena said she was waiting. The woman asked whom she was waiting for. Elena said she was waiting for her. Mrs. Ferraro stared at her for a long time, and there was nothing absent or unfocused in her gaze. There was something as sharp as a knife. Then she told Elena not to imagine she was the first person to think of sitting outside the door. Elena said she didn't imagine that. The woman stepped back into the room and left the door open. That was how Elena entered that room for the first time. The next 3 days passed in a state Elena privately called a truce. Mrs. Ferraro spoke no more than 5 sentences to her each day, but she didn't dismiss her either. Late in the afternoon on the 4th day, she was sitting in her usual place when she turned and asked Elena whether anyone had called him, because he had said he would be home before dinner. Elena knew that Mrs. Ferraro's husband had died 6 years earlier. Margaret had told her on her first day, along with instructions that if the old woman mentioned him, Elena should gently say that he was away. Elena didn't say he was away. She didn't say he was dead, and she didn't tell her that she had asked the same question the day before. Instead, she asked a different question. She asked what he liked to drink. Mrs. Ferraro blinked, and her expression softened slightly. Then she said coffee, very strong, with no sugar, and that he always complained that no one in that house knew how to make a decent cup of coffee. Elena went downstairs and made 2 cups. She brought them up, placed one in front of Mrs. Ferraro and the other across from her on the small table, then sat in her own chair in the corner of the room and said nothing more. Mrs. Ferraro stared at the 2nd cup of coffee for a long time. She didn't drink. She didn't ask another question about her husband for the rest of that evening. When darkness had fully settled outside, she said, without looking toward Elena, that all 4 caregivers before her had told her he was dead, and they had said it in the voice people used when explaining something to a child. Elena said she knew he had died. Mrs. Ferraro said she knew it too. Most of the time, she knew. The worst part wasn't forgetting. It was having someone correct her the very moment she forgot. The following day, Elena brought upstairs a small handheld voice recorder she had bought with an advance on her wages from an electronics store near the bus stop. She placed it on the table, showed Mrs. Ferraro the red button, and said that if there was anything she wanted to remember, she could press it and speak into the recorder, and no one would listen unless she gave them permission. Mrs. Ferraro picked it up and examined it, then asked whether Elena thought she was the sort of person who needed such a thing. Elena said she thought everyone needed a place to keep the things they didn't want to lose. Mrs. Ferraro set it down on the table beside the lamp and said nothing more. That afternoon, she suddenly mentioned almond ricotta cake, the kind her mother had made for every holiday when she was a little girl in the Taylor Street neighborhood, and she said in an almost reproachful voice that no one in that house knew how to make it. Elena asked whether the recipe had ever been written down. Mrs. Ferraro said she couldn't remember. Elena went down to the basement storage room and spent nearly 2 hours searching through cardboard boxes filled with old belongings before she found a tin cookie box. Inside were handwritten recipe cards covered in faded blue ink, with Italian mixed among the English. She brought the box upstairs. That evening, the 2 women went down to the kitchen. Mrs. Ferraro stood beside the island and named each ingredient as though she were reciting it from memory. Ricotta, ground almonds, lemon zest. Then she stopped. She remained silent for quite some time. Elena didn't prompt her. She simply reached for the cinnamon and vanilla, set the 2 jars side by side where Mrs. Ferraro could see them, then turned away to wash the dishes. Behind her, Mrs. Ferraro said, "Oh yes, cinnamon and vanilla, of course vanilla." Elena said yes, of course. The cake came out of the oven at nearly 11 o'clock that night. Mrs. Ferraro ate 1 piece, sat in silence for a long time, then said it was almost right. Elena said it would be closer next time. The old woman looked at her and said the girl shouldn't imagine that meant she would be allowed to stay. But the following morning, when Margaret came upstairs and asked whether she needed someone else, Mrs. Ferraro said no. 6 days after they baked the cake, Margaret knocked on Elena's door close to midnight and said the owner wanted to see her in his study. Elena asked what had happened. Margaret said that was exactly the kind of question she had warned Elena never to ask, then turned and walked away. Elena put her jacket back on, went downstairs, and stopped at the entrance to the hallway leading into the east wing, the area she had been ordered never to enter. The study door stood slightly open. Inside, the man was sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers, and he didn't look up when she entered. He merely told her to sit down, and Elena took the chair across from him, resting both hands in her lap. He finished writing one final line, capped his pen, and only then looked at her. He said his mother had never kept anyone longer than 13 days, and today was Elena's 11th. Elena didn't know how to answer, so she said nothing. He opened a drawer, took out a thick envelope, placed it on the desk, and pushed it toward her. Then he said very clearly that he wanted to know what his mother said. Everything. Whom she mentioned, what she remembered, what she forgot, and whom she spoke to when there were guests in the house, once a week, or sooner if anything unusual happened. The money in the envelope was a separate payment, outside her contract, and no one needed to know about it. Elena looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. She said she would tell him what his mother said because that was something any caregiver should do for a patient's family, but she wouldn't accept money for it. He asked why. She said that if she took it, then every time she opened her mouth, both of them would wonder whether she was speaking for his mother or for the envelope. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in the conversation, he truly looked at her instead of evaluating her. He said no one in that house had ever refused his money. Elena said she wasn't refusing it. She was simply proposing another arrangement. Then she continued, saying she would do what he asked, but she had one condition. He raised an eyebrow, and she stated it in the same calm voice she might have used to read a line from a contract. He had to be prepared to believe his mother on the day Elena came downstairs with something that sounded impossible, because if he intended to believe only the things that suited him, then there was no point in Elena reporting anything at all, and he could save both of them the time. The room fell silent. Outside the window came the sound of tires grinding over gravel as someone arrived home late. Then the noise faded completely. He wasn't angry. The frightening thing was that he wasn't angry at all. He simply sat there, and Elena had the feeling that she had just laid her hand on the surface of water that was perfectly still and unimaginably deep. At last, he said she was bargaining with him, in his own house, after only 11 days of work. Elena said she wasn't bargaining for herself. She was bargaining for his mother. Then she added, her voice still no louder than before, that she owed $190,000. She was sleeping in a room that didn't belong to her, and he could throw her out the next morning. So in truth, she had nothing to lose in that conversation. He looked at her for a very long time. Then he pulled the envelope back toward himself, returned it to the drawer, and said she could go back to her room. Elena stood, walked to the door, and he called her name for the first time. He asked whether his mother ever mentioned him. Elena stopped, turned around, and said that she had. On Tuesday, she had told Elena about the time he broke his arm at 8 years old after climbing onto the roof of the storage shed, and she had laughed while telling the story. Elena didn't add that half an hour later, his mother had asked when her son was coming home. He gave one barely perceptible nod, then lowered his eyes to the stack of papers. When the door closed behind her, Dante Ferraro remained motionless in that room for a long while, thinking about an autumn night 3 years earlier. When the telephone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning, and a state trooper on the other end asked whether he was a relative of an elderly woman named Rosalind Ferraro. They had found her walking barefoot along the shoulder of Interstate 94, 11 miles from home, with no wallet and no identification, wearing only a thin robe. When Dante arrived, she was sitting in the back of the patrol car, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given her. He opened the car door, knelt in front of her, and called her by the name he had used for 34 years. She looked at him for a long time, with perfect politeness, and asked who he was. In his life, Dante Ferraro had made grown men tremble simply by walking into a room. That night, on the shoulder of the highway, he didn't know what to do with his hands. He took off his coat and wrapped it around his mother's shoulders, and as he did, he understood something he had never before been forced to face. There were things that couldn't be bought, couldn't be threatened into submission, and couldn't be fixed by anyone in his entire organization. He switched off the desk lamp and sat in the darkness for a while. The girl's words remained intact in his mind, and what troubled him wasn't that she had dared to say them. It was that he wasn't certain he would be able to keep that promise. By the third weekend, Margaret announced that there would be guests for dinner on Saturday evening, and reminded Elena to remember the first rule. Elena asked whether Mrs. Ferraro should be brought downstairs, and Margaret said yes. She would sit at the table, because the owner had requested it. The guests arrived at 7 o'clock. The woman was 31 years old, the daughter of a real estate family whose name Elena had seen on construction signs along the riverfront, and she entered the house with the manner of someone already accustomed to thinking she would soon own it. She went straight to Mrs. Ferraro, bent down to kiss her cheek, and called her mom. The second guest was a man of about 41 with salt and pepper hair, whom Nico quietly addressed as Mr. Kane when he opened the door for him. In the kitchen, Margaret briefly explained that he was Victor Kane, that he had worked with the owner for 15 years, and that he was the only person outside the family permitted to enter the East Wing. Dinner lasted 2 hours. Elena moved in and out of the dining room serving the meal, observing without appearing to observe. Sienna Blake was extremely attentive to Mrs. Ferraro. She cut the meat on the old woman's plate into small pieces before Mrs. Ferraro had a chance to pick up her knife, reminded her to drink water, and moved the portion of cake with almonds aside because, as she explained, Mom couldn't eat hard nuts. Mrs. Ferraro said she had been eating almonds since she was 4 years old. Sienna smiled and said she knew. But things were different now, Mom. And she spoke in such a gentle voice that no one at the table seemed to find anything wrong with it. Then she turned toward Dante and began talking about the wedding. About how September by the lake would be beautiful, but October would offer better light for photographs, and about approximately how many guests her family would invite. Dante listened and nodded from time to time, making no specific promises. Victor Kane barely spoke at all. He asked Mrs. Ferraro one question about the old Taylor Street neighborhood, then sat listening to her talk for 10 minutes without interrupting once, and when she repeated something she had already told him, he nodded as though he were hearing it for the first time. Elena thought it was the kindest behavior she had witnessed at that table. She made a quiet note of it, then forgot about it. At 9:30, Dante and Victor went into the east wing. Elena took Mrs. Ferraro upstairs to her room, returned to the kitchen to clean up, and as she passed through the short hallway connecting the kitchen to the living room, she heard Sienna's voice. She was speaking to Margaret. Her voice was completely different. It wasn't louder or sharper. It had simply gone flat and practical, the tone people used when discussing furniture. She told Margaret that all the old photographs on the living room shelves needed to be put away. Margaret asked if she meant every one of them. Sienna said all of them, placed in storage, not thrown away. Then she added that the house was living in the past, that every time the old woman saw a photograph of her late husband, she began asking when he was coming home, and no one could treat her while that kept happening. She said even the doctor had advised limiting anything that caused disorientation. Elena stopped at the corner. She stood perfectly still, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, and continued listening. Sienna said she wasn't a bad person. She was simply the only person in that house willing to speak the truth. Dante was deceiving himself. That house wasn't a medical facility. There were no trained staff members on duty at night, no emergency call button, and no one capable of handling the situation if Mrs. Ferraro fell in the bathroom at 3 o'clock in the morning. There were specialized facilities, the finest in the state, where the waiting list was 2 years long, but the Blake family had connections. Those places had procedures, physicians on duty, and everything a person in her condition needed. Keeping her there wasn't love. It was selfishness dressed up to look beautiful. Margaret said nothing. Sienna continued, saying she wouldn't raise the subject with Dante yet because he wasn't ready. But after the wedding, the conversation would have to happen, and she hoped Margaret understood that when the time came, Sienna would need someone standing on her side. Elena stood there and realized that what chilled her wasn't what Sienna was saying. It was that every sentence was half true. The house truly didn't have an emergency call button. There truly was no one on duty at night except Elena. And if someone recorded that entire conversation and played it for a panel of 10 strangers, all 10 of them would believe that the woman was worried about an elderly lady. Elena turned back the way she had come and went around through the pantry door so she wouldn't have to cross the living room, then returned to the kitchen and finished washing the glasses. She didn't tell Margaret that she had overheard them. She didn't write it down anywhere either. She had worked there for only 3 weeks. She owed $190,000, and she understood perfectly well the position of someone newly arrived in a house where everyone had already chosen a side. That night, when she went upstairs for her final check, Mrs. Ferraro was still awake. She asked whether that girl had left. Elena said she had. Mrs. Ferraro was silent for a moment, then said that the girl had cut the meat on her plate. Elena said yes, she had seen it. The old woman said she was 71 years old and had managed her own life for 71 years, and the worst part wasn't being treated like a child. It was that everyone at the table had watched her dignity being stripped away, and no one had said a word. Elena pulled the blanket up around her and said that tomorrow she would cut her own meat. Mrs. Ferraro closed her eyes and said this girl was smarter than the 4 who came before her. 4 months passed in a rhythm Elena gradually learned by heart, and by the middle of October, Mrs. Ferraro had allowed her to call her Rosalind. The air was dry that afternoon. The gardener was trimming the row of roses along the southern walkway, and Rosalind wanted to go outside. Elena took her downstairs, settled her on the stone bench facing the greenhouse, covered her with a light blanket, then returned to the kitchen because Margaret had called for her. She was gone for about 20 minutes. When she came back out, Rosalind was still sitting exactly where Elena had left her, but her hands were gripping the edge of the blanket, and she didn't turn when Elena called her name. Elena asked if she was cold. Rosalind said no. Then she said nothing more for the entire walk back into the house. And that was unusual, because she was a woman who always talked. At 7 o'clock that evening, when Dante came home, Rosalind was sitting in the living room, and she stood the moment she heard the door. She told her son to sit down. Margaret was setting down the tea tray. Elena was standing in the corner waiting to take Rosalind upstairs, and both women remained where they were because Rosalind hadn't asked them to leave. Rosalind said she had seen Sienna in the greenhouse that afternoon, and the other man had been there too, Dante's friend, Mr. Kane. Dante asked what they had been doing. She said they had only been standing there talking, nothing more, and she couldn't hear anything because the glass was thick. But then she continued, her voice slowing, and said the girl had a strand of hair fall across her face, and he had raised his hand and tucked it behind her ear. Rosalind said she had seen it clearly. Dante didn't answer at once. He took out his phone, opened his calendar, scrolled down, then looked up and said Victor hadn't been there that day. He had been in Milwaukee since morning, with one meeting at 10 o'clock and another at 2, and he had sent a message 40 minutes earlier saying he was on his way home. Rosalind said she knew what she had seen. Dante's voice remained gentle, without the slightest trace of impatience, and it was that very gentleness that made the moment ache. He said, "Mom, maybe you're remembering last week. Victor was here that day. You've only confused the date." Rosalind was silent for several seconds. Then she said with perfect clarity that she might forget what day of the week it was. She might forget whether she had eaten breakfast, and she might forget the name of the girl standing in the corner even though she was fond of her. But she had lived with a man for nearly 40 years, and she couldn't forget the way a man touched a woman who didn't belong to him. Those were two different things, and her son ought to know the difference. Dante placed his phone on the table. For one moment, Elena saw him hesitate, truly hesitate, and she thought he was about to ask another question. But then he stood, walked over, kissed his mother on the forehead, and said he would ask Victor. He promised. Then he told Margaret to take her upstairs to rest, because she had spent too long outside that day. Margaret stepped forward to take Rosalind's arm. Rosalind pulled it away and rose without assistance. She climbed the stairs alone with her back straight, while Margaret followed half a step behind her. Elena remained in the corner. She had been in that house for 4 months. She had signed a piece of paper saying she wouldn't ask questions and wouldn't speak, and she understood perfectly well that if she opened her mouth at that moment, someone else would be standing in her place within 24 hours. She said nothing. Dante crossed into the east wing and closed the door behind him. Later, when everything was over, Elena would still remember exactly how she had felt in that moment. It wasn't anger. It was a very old kind of weariness. The feeling of someone who had once stood in a clinic and listened to a doctor speak to her mother in the voice reserved for children, and who had learned that there were truths that lost their value the instant they were spoken by the wrong person. At 11 o'clock that night, Elena went upstairs for her final check. Rosalind was still sitting upright in bed, the bedside lamp glowing, her hands resting on the blanket. Elena asked if she needed any water. Rosalind didn't answer the question. She reached out and took hold of Elena's wrist, gripping it tightly, then asked if Elena believed her. Elena stood there. She thought of the past 4 months she had spent standing outside and looking in. She thought of Rosalind's hand clutching the edge of the blanket that afternoon. She thought about how Rosalind had never claimed to have heard anything. She had only said what she had seen, because she knew she could stand behind only what her own eyes had witnessed. No one who had lost her mind would place such a careful limit on her own testimony. Elena said she believed her. Rosalind didn't cry. She merely nodded once and released Elena's wrist. Then she asked if Elena knew what the worst part was. It wasn't that he didn't believe her. It was that he believed her more than he was willing to admit that day. But he didn't dare, because if he believed her, he would have to do something very difficult. Elena pulled the blanket higher and told her to rest. The old woman took hold of her wrist again, and this time she spoke more quietly, telling Elena not to tell anyone about this, not even Margaret. Elena asked why. Rosalind said that in that house, there had been 2 people no one was willing to listen to. And now there were 2. Elena switched off the lamp, closed the door, and stood in the dark hallway for a long time. There was only one question in her mind. If someone had already constructed an entire afternoon in Milwaukee, how long ago had they begun building it? 9 days after that evening, Sienna Blake's moving truck pulled up in front of the main entrance, and she walked into the house with the perfectly reasonable explanation that the wedding was only 3 months away, and no one could plan a ceremony for 200 guests over the phone. Dante didn't object. The very next morning, Sienna called Margaret and Elena down to the dining room, spread a sheet of paper across the table, and announced that she had sought professional advice, and that from then on, Mom's daily routine would be adjusted. Breakfast would be moved back by 1 hour. Dinner would be served 1 hour earlier. Bedtime would be fixed at 9 o'clock. And afternoon naps would be eliminated entirely because, she said, sleeping during the day disrupted the body's nighttime rhythm. Elena said that sudden changes in routine often caused agitation in people with dementia, and that if they wanted to make adjustments, they should do so gradually over the course of several weeks. Sienna looked at her, smiled, and asked where she had learned that. Elena said she had studied nursing for 3 years. Sienna said 3 years, which meant she hadn't finished, and she said it without the slightest edge in her voice, almost as though she sympathized. Then she folded the paper and told Margaret to put the new schedule into effect the following day. The next week, the night nurse who had worked there for nearly 2 years was informed that her contract was being terminated because of staff reductions, and her replacement was a woman recommended by the Blake family. She worked the night shift, spoke very little, never ate with the household staff, and kept her own key to the medicine cabinet. Elena was reassigned downstairs to the kitchen and laundry room on a fixed schedule, and Sienna explained in front of everyone that this was fairer to all of them, because no one should be expected to perform both jobs. She added that Miss Novak could still go upstairs to visit Mom whenever she had time. Elena understood exactly what that meant. There were 22 steps between the second floor and the kitchen, and over the next 3 weeks, she climbed them 3 times a day during her breaks, never staying longer than 15 minutes at a time, just long enough to see Rosalind beginning to nod off in the afternoons and waking at hours when she shouldn't have been awake. On the 23rd night, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, a disturbance woke the entire floor. Elena sprang out of bed in her room in the servants' quarters and ran upstairs. By the time she arrived, Rosalind's bedroom door was already open. The old woman stood in the middle of the room, barefoot, one hand gripping the back of a chair, calling her husband's name loudly, over and over. She looked around the room where she had slept for 40 years and asked where she was, who had brought her there, and said she wanted to go home. The night nurse stood in the doorway holding a glass of water and made no move to enter. At the far end of the hallway, the master bedroom door opened. Sienna stepped out with her hair hastily tied back, looked at the scene for exactly 3 seconds, then told the nurse to deal with it. Without raising her voice, she added that this was exactly what people were paid to do. Then she went back inside and closed the door. The click of the lock could be heard clearly throughout the hallway. The nurse set the glass of water on the table outside the door and said she would prepare something to calm Rosalind down. Elena stepped past her, entered the room, and told her to leave it alone. She didn't turn on the light. She merely closed the door to shut out the noise from the hallway, then sat down on the floor with her back against the foot of the bed, about 2 paces from where Rosalind was standing, and she didn't reach out her hands. In an ordinary voice, without coaxing or soothing her, Elena said that it was cold outside and warm in the room, and that Rosalind could remain standing for as long as she wished, because Elena would sit right there. Rosalind asked where she was. Elena didn't tell her she was in her own home. Instead, she asked how many steps led up to the house Rosalind wanted to return to. Rosalind stopped. She said there were 3 steps, that the middle one was cracked, and that her father was always promising to repair it. Elena asked who used to sit on the top step. Rosalind said she did, along with her older sister. Elena asked her sister's name. Rosalind said Antonia. Then she began talking about summers on Taylor Street, about her mother opening the kitchen window and calling the 2 girls inside to eat. As she spoke, her breathing gradually slowed, and at some point, without seeming to realize it, she sat down on the edge of the bed. Elena remained on the floor. She didn't repeat the name of anyone who had died, and she didn't say a single sentence that began with the word but. Whenever Rosalind repeated something she had already told her, Elena asked for one new detail from that part of the story. Close to 4:30, Rosalind said she was tired. Elena helped her lie down and pulled the blanket over her, and Rosalind took hold of her hand. Elena didn't pull away. She lowered herself back onto the floor, rested her head against the edge of the bed, and left her hand inside Rosalind's, intending only to close her eyes for a moment. At 5:15, Dante Ferraro came home. He went upstairs, walked along the hallway, and saw that his mother's bedroom door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently. Inside, His mother was asleep with her face turned toward the edge of the bed. On the floor, the girl had fallen asleep with her head resting against the mattress, and his mother still held one of her hands. The window was open, a crack, and the room was cold. He stood there for a long time. Then he took off his overcoat, stepped inside, and laid it across Elena's shoulders. He didn't wake either of them. He walked out, closed the door very softly behind him, and went straight downstairs. The overcoat was folded and placed on the chair outside the study door the following morning, and no one in the house ever mentioned it again. 3 weeks later, in the middle of November, Sienna organized a party to celebrate Rosalind's 71st birthday. She hired a photographer, invited around 40 guests, most of them friends of the Blake family and several people Elena had never seen before, ordered flowers from a shop on Oak Street, and spent the 2 days beforehand repeating that Mom would be so happy someone was finally making an effort for her. Elena asked Margaret whether they should reduce the number of guests. Margaret said she had already suggested it. The party began at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By 4:20, Rosalind had begun asking who all those people were. At 4:30, when the photographer asked everyone to move closer together for a group picture, and 3 strangers placed their hands on Rosalind's shoulders at the same time, she jerked away and rose from her chair. The music, the voices, the clinking of glasses, all of it pressed together into a single overwhelming mass. Rosalind said she wanted to return to her room. Sienna took hold of her elbow and said, "Mom, just one more picture." Elena set her tray down on a side table, stepped forward, and told Sienna that Rosalind needed to leave the room, keeping her voice just loud enough for the two of them to hear. Sienna released her arm. Elena led Rosalind away, avoiding the main hall and taking her through the kitchen corridor instead. There was no one in the kitchen. Elena pulled out a chair for her at the island, poured her a glass of water, then cut her a separate slice of the birthday cake. The cake no one outside had bothered to ask whether she even liked, and placed it in front of her. Rosalind's hands were still trembling. Elena walked over to the old record player on top of the china cabinet, something she had noticed during her first month in the house but had never turned on, searched through the stack of records beneath it, chose one, and lowered the needle. Old music filled the kitchen, a ballad recorded sometime in the 60s, with the faintly scratchy sound of a flute. Elena returned to the sink and began rinsing a few glasses. Behind her, someone began to sing. She turned around. Rosalind was sitting upright in her chair, her hands resting on the table, her eyes fixed on the empty space ahead of her, and she was singing along. She didn't miss a single word. She didn't falter once. She sang the entire chorus, then continued into the next verse, singing even the lines that Elena, who had heard her forget her own son's name twice that week, hadn't imagined could still exist anywhere inside her mind. Elena stood motionless, a glass still in her hand. Outside the kitchen doorway, Dante Ferraro stopped. He had been searching for his mother for 10 minutes. He didn't enter. He remained at the threshold with one hand resting on the doorframe and listened to the song from beginning to end. When the record finished and the needle lifted, Rosalind turned toward Elena and said that her father used to play that song on Saturday evenings, and that he had been a terrible dancer. Elena said yes. Dante stepped back from the doorway and returned to the main hall before anyone could see him. 3 days after the party, Elena went down to the basement to put away the tablecloths, and while clearing a corner filled with cardboard boxes, she discovered a flat box tied with string. Inside was a wedding dress that had yellowed with age. The fabric had grown stiff, and the bodice was beyond saving. But the lace on both sleeves remained intact. She asked Margaret whether anyone still had any use for the dress, and Margaret said it had been down there since before she began working in the house. Elena borrowed a needle and thread and spent 3 evenings removing the lace and sewing it into a shoulder shawl, light enough for a 71-year-old woman to wear all day without feeling its weight, and long enough to fall past her elbows. On Saturday morning, Elena carried it upstairs and placed it in Rosalind's hands without explaining what it was. Rosalind lifted it, brought it close to her eyes, and remained silent for a very long time. At that moment, Sienna passed the doorway. She stopped, looked at the lace, and asked where it had come from. Elena said she had taken it from the dress in storage. Sienna entered the room and said that the dress belonged to the family, that it might have been placed in a glass frame or preserved for future generations, and that a hired employee taking it upon herself to cut it into pieces was an act of destruction. She said she would have to report it to Dante. Elena said yes. Sienna asked whether she had any idea how much that dress was worth. Elena said she didn't. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Dante had been standing there for some time. He entered the room, looked at Sienna, then turned toward his mother. Rosalind took no part in the argument. She was sitting in her chair with the lace spread across both knees, slowly tracing its edge with one finger, following one curve and then another. Then, without looking at anyone, she said she remembered how the church had smelled that day, the scent of candles and damp wood, because the rain had just ended. She said she had waited at the entrance longer than expected, because the truck carrying the flowers had arrived late. She continued, saying she had been 19 years old, and so frightened that she couldn't even remember which foot she had stepped forward with first. The room fell silent. Sienna opened her mouth to continue. Dante raised one hand a few inches without turning toward her, and she stopped. He watched his mother stroke the lace for another moment. Then he said the matter of the dress was closed, and he walked out. He said nothing else to Elena, and didn't look in her direction. But that evening, when Elena carried the tray upstairs, she saw that the lace shawl had been carefully folded and placed at the head of Rosalind's bed, instead of being put away in the closet. In early December, Rosalind's supplemental prescription was sent by Dr. Kessler to the pharmacy in Highwood, and Margaret told Elena to pick it up before 5 o'clock, because the following day was Sunday, and the pharmacy would be closed. At 3:45, Elena went downstairs and asked the driver. Nico said the car had been gone since noon because Sienna needed to shop in the Michigan Avenue district, and no one knew what time she would return. He said he could drive Elena, but he had to remain on duty at the gate until 6 o'clock. Elena looked at the clock, said it was all right, and walked to the bus stop nearly a mile from the main gate. Snow was falling heavily, the kind Chicagoans called wet snow, and by the time she reached the halfway point, both her feet were soaked through. She had covered about 2/3 of the distance when headlights shone behind her. The car slowed, then stopped beside her, the window lowered. Dante Ferraro looked out and didn't ask what she was doing. He simply told her to get in. Elena said she was soaking wet. He said that wasn't what he had asked. She opened the rear door, and he told her to sit up front. The car was warm. He didn't turn on any music. He drove onto the main road and asked where she was going. She said the pharmacy in Highwood. He nodded and turned in that direction. A few minutes later, he asked her a question she hadn't expected. He asked why she had taken this job. Elena said it was because of the pay. He said he knew about the money. The broker had told him about the debt. He said he wanted to know why she had chosen this particular job, caring for someone like his mother, when she could work the same number of hours doing almost anything else without having to spend the night in a stranger's house. Elena was silent for a moment while the windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. Then she said she had already done this work for 4 years without being paid. Without turning to look at him, she continued, saying that people often thought the most terrible thing was being forgotten. She said that wasn't the most terrible thing. She told him about an afternoon at the clinic, when her mother had been sitting right there, fully alert, with her hands resting in her lap, and the doctor had turned to Elena and begun speaking about her mother in the third person. Was she still able to eat? Did she wander often? She would need supervision. Elena said it had been she this and she that for 15 minutes, in a room with 3 people, and not once had he spoken to her mother. Elena said her mother had heard every word. On the way home, she had taken Elena's hand and asked if she had become a subject now. Elena told Dante that was the day she applied to put her studies on hold. It wasn't because her mother's illness had grown worse. It was because Elena had realized that if she wasn't present in those rooms, there would be no one left to call her mother by her name. Dante said nothing for a long stretch of road. On both sides of them stood rows of bare trees, with snow clinging to their branches in uneven patches. Then he said that 3 years earlier, he had sat in a room just like that one. Elena didn't ask anything more. When they reached the pharmacy, she went inside, collected the medicine, signed for it, and came back out to find the car still parked where he had left it, the engine running. On the way home, he asked her another question. He asked if she was afraid of him. Elena thought of the 2 men at the gate, the cars without license plates, the East Wing, and the way Margaret stepped back half a pace whenever he passed. She said yes. She told him she was afraid of him. Then she added that she was more afraid of the debt. She didn't say it to please him, but because it was the truth. He could dismiss her at any moment, and she would lose a job. But that number would follow her for the rest of her life, and it didn't care how she felt. He kept his eyes on the road and said that most people who were afraid of him lied about it. Elena said she had no reason to lie. He had known that number before she had. Dante didn't smile, but something at the corner of his mouth changed. He asked how his mother had been that day. Elena said Rosalind had slept for an hour in the afternoon, remembered the name of their former mail carrier that morning, and asked twice that afternoon what day of the week it was. He asked whether she had mentioned the greenhouse again. Elena said no, she hadn't mentioned it again. She considered her next words for exactly 2 seconds, then added that Rosalind not mentioning it again didn't mean she had forgotten. Dante didn't answer. He didn't promise to question Victor again, didn't say he would look into it, and didn't say anything at all. He simply drove. At the gate, he stopped in front of the entrance to the servants' quarters instead of the main entrance, and told her to go in through the kitchen so she wouldn't get the floor in the front hall wet. Elena thanked him and stepped out of the car. She had taken 3 steps when he lowered the window and called her name. Then he said that the next time the car was unavailable, she was to tell him and not walk. She said yes. Upstairs, behind the curtains of the master bedroom window, Sienna Blake stood watching the car parked in the courtyard. She watched the front passenger door open, watched the girl step out, and remained there until both of them had disappeared from view. In the second week of December, a delivery truck brought 4 boxes of Christmas decorations Sienna had ordered, and the workers left them all at the kitchen entrance. Elena was trying to drag the second box over the threshold when Nico walked past, set down his radio, and lifted it with one hand. He asked what was inside that made it so heavy. She said she didn't know. She had only been told to carry it into storage. He opened the box, looked inside, then said there were 32 porcelain reindeer in there, and asked how many reindeer she thought one house needed before it had enough. Elena laughed. It was a real laugh, escaping before she could hold it back, and she realized it was the first time she had laughed that way in months. Nico laughed too and began stacking the boxes in the storeroom. At the far end of the hallway, Dante Ferraro watched them for several seconds before continuing on his way. He said nothing to Nico, but that afternoon, when Elena brought down the tea tray, he was sitting in the dining room with a file in front of him, and he looked up and asked what she had been laughing about that morning. Elena hesitated for half a beat. She said it had been about the porcelain reindeer. He asked if that was all. She said yes, that was all. He watched her for another moment, then lowered his eyes to the stack of papers. From the doorway, Sienna called into the room in a voice as light as if she were joking, saying that he had never asked Nico what he was laughing about. He had only asked her. Dante didn't look up. He said Nico didn't work on the second floor. Sienna laughed and changed the subject to the invitations, but she didn't leave the doorway until Elena had gone. That night, as Elena walked from the laundry room back to her room, Sienna was waiting at the bend in the hallway. She didn't block Elena's path. She merely stood there with her arms folded across her chest and said she wanted to speak to Elena as one woman speaking to another. Elena stopped. Sienna said she understood, truly understood, that working in a house like this made it very easy to start imagining things. It happened to everyone. A person found herself receiving a little attention, being asked a few questions, and she began telling herself a story. Sienna said Dante was kind in his own way, and he might be grateful to Elena for everything she had done for his mother, and that gratitude was genuine. But gratitude wasn't something else. Men in his position didn't marry women in hers. Sienna didn't raise her voice when she said it. She spoke almost as though she were trying to help. Then she added that she was telling Elena this so she wouldn't waste her time, because she had seen the same thing happen many times in the homes of her friends, and it had never ended well for the person who remained downstairs. Elena listened to every word. She didn't blush and didn't argue. She merely said she had entered that house to repay a debt, not to find a husband, and when the debt was paid, she would leave. Sienna looked at her for a moment, then said, "Good, then we understand each other." Elena said yes and continued on her way. On her day off that week, Elena took the bus to Avondale to visit Tomas. On the way back, she was waiting at the stop near Green Bay Road when a woman around 46 years old walked up and stood beside her, a cup of coffee in her hand, and said Elena's name. She didn't ask. She stated it. Elena turned toward her. The woman held out an identification card with a photograph, let Elena look at it long enough, then put it away and said her name was Claire Whitmore. She said she hadn't come to frighten Elena, and that Elena could walk away at any time. The bus wouldn't arrive for another 6 minutes. Then she said she knew Elena owed $190,000 because she had co-signed twice. You knew her 19-year-old brother was in his second year of college and worked part-time at the auto parts store on Kedzie Avenue, and knew Elena was sleeping on the 3rd floor of a house in Lake Forest. Elena asked what she wanted. Whitmore said she didn't need Elena to do anything at the moment. She only needed someone inside that house to know that a certain telephone number existed. She said the people who worked in houses like that were often the last to know what was happening, and the first to suffer the consequences when everything collapsed. She said there were programs available for people who cooperated, and that debt wasn't impossible to resolve if the right people were sitting at the table. Elena asked if she was trying to threaten her. Whitmore said no. She was merely describing the situation. Elena said she cleaned floors, did laundry, and cared for a 71-year-old woman. She wasn't allowed into the East Wing, wasn't permitted to answer telephones on the second floor, and didn't know anything worth Whitmore's time. Whitmore said she knew. Then she added that this was precisely why she was standing there instead of someone else. The bus arrived. Whitmore held out a business card. Elena said she wouldn't take it. Whitmore didn't withdraw her hand. She simply kept it there and said Elena could take it and throw it away if she wished, but she shouldn't make Whitmore come back there again merely to give it to her. Elena took the card. She boarded the bus, sat down, and as it pulled away, she slipped the business card into the small inner compartment of her wallet, beside her library card and an old photograph. Almost without thinking, the way a person put away a piece of paper without yet knowing what it might be used for. Then, she looked out the window and thought about how she needed to check the medicine box again that evening, because Rosalind's confusion had been severe throughout the previous afternoon, and Elena didn't understand why. Elena began keeping a record, not because she suspected anything in particular, but because that was what she had been taught in her second year, that when a symptom fluctuated, the first thing to do was write down the date and time, not guess at the cause. She used the back pages of the grocery notebook kept in the kitchen drawer, one line for each day, and she continued for 3 weeks. At the end of the third week, she placed the notebook on the kitchen island at 11 o'clock at night and read it again from the beginning, and what she saw left her sitting motionless for a very long time. The days when Rosalind's confusion was at its worst didn't fall on weekends, didn't come when the weather turned colder, and didn't follow nights when she had slept poorly. They fell on November 11th, when the Blake family came for dinner. November 20th, when 4 men entered the East Wing and remained there until late. November 29th, the day of the photographs. December 4th, the day Sienna brought the wedding designer to the house. And on every one of those days, Rosalind began growing drowsy around the middle of the morning, drifted in and out of sleep throughout the afternoon, and by evening was speaking incoherently in front of precisely the people who happened to be in the house. On days when no one came, she was alert, argued with Elena about the salt in the soup, and remembered her sister's name. Elena closed the notebook. The next morning, she went upstairs after the night nurse had left, and while Rosalind was bathing, and she opened the 7-compartment pill organizer on the table. She had looked at that box hundreds of times. This time, she counted, Dr. Kessler's prescription contained 4 medications, and Elena knew all 4 by heart. Their shapes, their colors, and the markings stamped into each tablet. In each compartment for the next 3 days, there was a 5th pill she had never seen on the prescription. It wasn't present in any of the compartments for the remaining days. Elena stood there for nearly half a minute, and she realized that her hands had gone cold. Her phone was inside the locked cabinet at the foot of the stairs, because that was the 3rd rule Margaret had read to her on her first day, and one she had never needed to repeat. Elena hadn't brought it upstairs. She took a medicine wrapper from the drawer, placed the pill on it, copied the marking from the tablet in pencil, then returned it to exactly the same place, closed the lid, and went downstairs. She retrieved her phone from the cabinet, walked into the backyard, stood out of sight behind the kitchen wall, and photographed the paper, the copy of the prescription she kept in the care log, and the page of the grocery notebook containing the dates. Then, she went into the kitchen, lifted the receiver of the wall telephone beside the pantry door, and called the pharmacy in Highwood. She gave the patient's name, read the marking stamped on the pill, and asked whether it appeared on any prescription for that patient. The pharmacist said it didn't. She asked whether he knew what the medication was. He said he did, and named the class of drug, a sedative, then added that it generally wasn't recommended for elderly patients with dementia. He asked who was giving it to her. Elena said she didn't know. He was silent for several seconds, then asked whether she wanted him to check if any recent prescription had been filled for that address. She said yes. He checked, then said a prescription had been issued to the same address under someone else's name, a name Elena had never heard before, and that it had been collected by a registered nurse. Then he read the nurse's name aloud. Elena knew that name. It belonged to the night nurse Sienna had brought into the house. Elena thanked him, hung up the telephone, and leaned against the kitchen wall for a while. Then she did the only thing she could think of at that moment. She opened the china cabinet, took down the tin box containing the handwritten recipe cards, removed several cards from the bottom, and slipped the paper holding the pill and the small printout she had transferred from her phone between them. Then she arranged everything as it had been, and returned the box to its place on top of the cabinet. She didn't tell Margaret. She didn't go down to the East Wing. She had promised that man she would tell him, but she also remembered the October evening very clearly, the way he had opened his calendar and found an available afternoon in Milwaukee within 9 seconds, and she understood that if she took this matter downstairs with nothing but one pill and a grocery notebook, then within 24 hours, a perfectly reasonable explanation would be waiting, and she would be the one removed from the house. She needed the pill organizer untouched, on a day when an outsider would be there to witness it. That evening, when Elena went upstairs at 9 o'clock, the woman standing outside Rosalind's room wasn't the usual night nurse, but someone else, and she said there had been an unexpected change in the schedule. Elena asked whether the other nurse would be returning. The woman said she wasn't sure. The following morning, the nurse still hadn't appeared, and by afternoon, Margaret explained that Sienna had received word the nurse had to leave urgently due to a family emergency in her hometown. Dante accepted the explanation without question, assuming it was a routine resignation. Elena stood in the laundry room with a stack of towels in her arms and calculated the timing again. Earlier that morning, right after her call to the pharmacy, she had noticed Sienna quietly put down the extension phone in the pantry. Elena had made the call at 10:40 in the morning using the house telephone, realizing too late that someone might have been listening. On her next day off, she didn't return to Avondale. She went to the old bus stop and waited for 40 minutes until she saw the gray car parked across the street. Claire Whitmore lowered the window. Elena didn't get into the car. She remained on the sidewalk with both hands in her coat pockets and asked only one question: whether Whitmore's people could do anything if someone was removed from her own home. An elderly woman, taken away with legal documents and the signature of a family member. Whitmore didn't ask whom Elena meant. She watched her for a moment, then said they could, but someone would have to come forward and speak. Elena nodded, thanked her, and turned away. Whitmore called after her and asked whether Elena had anything for her. Elena said no, then walked to the stop and boarded the bus home. By the time Elena went back upstairs that evening, the pill organizer on the table had already been swapped for a fresh, empty one, and the former nurse was gone. The replacement nurse didn't prepare the organizer in advance, and for the next 2 weeks, Elena checked it every morning and found no more unfamiliar pills. Sienna had clearly covered her tracks, but she was too late. Elena already had the proof. The only thing she could see clearly was that Rosalind was far more alert. On the last Thursday afternoon in December, she sat in the chair beside the window, reading the obituary column in the local newspaper by herself, just as she had done for 40 years, and when Elena bent down to set the cup of tea beside her, the employee badge clipped to her collar flipped outward. Rosalind reached for it and held it still. She read it, then didn't let go. She asked Elena for her full name. Elena said Elena Novak. Rosalind asked what her father's name was. Elena said Peter. Rosalind lowered the newspaper into her lap. She asked where he had worked. Elena said he had worked at the port, in the Calumet district, and had died when she was 12. The woman sat motionless for a very long time, so long that Elena thought she had slipped into one of her vacant spells again. Then Rosalind said she had known her father. Elena straightened. Rosalind continued slowly, and her voice was very clear, clearer than Elena had ever heard it. She said that back then, her husband had controlled several unions in the port district, and one autumn, a report had been sent down for the foreman to sign, a document stating that a certain shipment had been counted in full when it hadn't been counted at all. She said most of the men signed it. One man refused. He didn't raise his voice, didn't file a complaint, and didn't report anyone. He merely said he wouldn't sign his name to something he hadn't seen with his own eyes, and then he went home. Rosalind said her husband hadn't laid a hand on him. She emphasized that point, almost bitterly. No one beat him. No one came to his house. Nothing happened at all. It was simply that 2 weeks later, his shifts were taken away. Then his name was passed around. After that, not a single port from there, north to Milwaukee, east to Gary, or around to Detroit, would accept his application. She said that was how her husband had operated, and people always imagined that families like hers settled everything through violence. But violence was loud and left evidence behind, while that list was silent, legal, and impossible for anyone to prove had ever existed. Elena remained exactly where she was. She remembered those years. She remembered her father working the morning shift at a warehouse, driving deliveries in the afternoon, and working nights at a gas station on Kedzie Avenue, 3 jobs for 4 years straight. She remembered him coming home near dawn and sitting on the front steps for a long time as he removed his shoes because his feet were swollen. She remembered her mother telling the neighbors that their family was going through a difficult time. She remembered the April evening when she was 12, when someone knocked on the door and told them he had collapsed in the gas station parking lot. He was 49. His heart had given out. Tomas had been 4 then, and he didn't remember their father's face. For 15 years, the entire family had believed he died because he worked himself to exhaustion, and that was true. It simply wasn't the whole truth. Rosalind said she had known about it from the beginning. She said she had confronted her husband, and she had done it more than once. She said she had stood in the kitchen of their old house and told him that the man had young children and hadn't harmed anyone, and she had begged him to remove his name from that list. Her husband had told her that if he did, 10 more men would refuse to sign the following spring. Then he told her that what happened at the port was none of her concern. Rosalind said she hadn't asked a third time. She said that was what she couldn't forgive herself for. Not that she had failed to stop him, but that she had stopped trying. Then she lifted her eyes to Elena and said she was sorry. She said she had waited 15 years to say those words to someone in that family, and she had never imagined that person would be standing in her room, pouring her tea, and watching over every pill she took. Elena said nothing. She stood there with one hand still resting on the edge of the tray, while everything in her mind slowly and cruelly rearranged itself into a new order. The debt of $190,000. The fact that she had abandoned her 3rd year of school. The extra shifts Tomas had taken at the auto parts store. All of it had begun because one man had been forbidden to work in the industry where he had spent 20 years of his life. She was earning a wage from the house that had created that list. She was repaying the debt with that very money. Rosalind reached out to take her hand. Elena didn't pull away, but she didn't return the gesture either. She told Rosalind to rest because it was getting dark. Rosalind asked her to say something. Elena said she didn't know what to say today. She spoke very softly, without the slightest trace of accusation in her voice, then carried the tray downstairs. She washed every cup in the kitchen. She finished folding the linens in the laundry room. Then she opened the back door, walked into the garden, sat on the stone bench facing the greenhouse, and remained there in the snow for a very long time. She didn't cry. She only sat with her hands in her coat pockets and thought about how, the next morning, she would still have to go up to the 2nd floor, still have to open the pill organizer and count, still have to keep a 71-year-old woman safe inside her own home. And she realized that the old woman didn't owe her anything. The man who owed her had died 6 years earlier, and no one could ever repay that debt now. By the time Margaret came outside to call her in, a thin layer of snow had settled across her shoulders. 3 days before the engagement party, Elena sat on the edge of the bed in her room on the 3rd floor and wrote her resignation letter by hand. It was exactly 4 lines long, with no explanation beyond the statement that her presence was creating tension within the family, and that she wished to end her contract after the party was over. She signed her name, folded the letter, went downstairs, walked along the hallway to the east wing, and slipped it beneath the door of the study. Then she went into the kitchen, because she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. Near midnight, the kitchen door opened. Dante Ferraro stood there with the letter in his hand. He didn't ask why. He placed it on the kitchen island, pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and asked whether she had ever considered that her leaving might hurt someone too. Elena said she had thought a great deal about his mother. He said he wasn't talking about his mother. The kitchen remained silent for a long time. Elena looked at the letter on the counter and said that in 3 days, he would stand before 120 people and announce that he was going to marry another woman. She said she had no intention of standing inside his uncertainty and waiting to see what he decided, because only one person would pay the price for that uncertainty, and that person wasn't him. Dante said he hadn't decided anything yet. Elena said yes, that was precisely the problem. He sat motionless, both hands resting on the counter, and he didn't argue. At last, he asked whether she would stay until the party was over. She said she would, because Rosalind would have to sit at the table of honor for 4 hours among people she didn't recognize, and Elena wouldn't leave her there alone. He nodded, picked up the letter, and before walking out, he said he hadn't signed it. The following afternoon, as Elena carried clean towels up to the 2nd floor, she found Rosalind's door tightly closed. Sienna's voice came from inside. It wasn't loud or harsh, only a steady stream of sound whose individual words couldn't be made out through the wooden door. Elena stood in the hallway with the stack of towels in her arms. The door opened after about 2 minutes. Sienna stepped out, saw her, and smiled as she said Rosalind was tired and shouldn't be disturbed. Then she went downstairs. Elena entered the room. Rosalind was sitting on the floor with her back against the foot of the bed, clutching the lace handkerchief so tightly in both hands that her knuckles had turned white. Elena sat down beside her and asked nothing. After a while, Rosalind spoke on her own. She said that girl had told her that if she said one more word to her son, she would wake up somewhere in Wisconsin the following week, and the young woman who cared for her would be nowhere she could ever find again. She repeated the threat a second time, almost word for word, then said she had asked that girl whether she knew whom she was speaking to. Elena asked how Sienna had answered. Rosalind said she had replied that she was speaking to someone who wouldn't remember the conversation by the next morning. Then Rosalind turned toward Elena and said that today she remembered everything. She remembered every word. Elena helped her back into bed, and Rosalind kept the lace handkerchief in her lap throughout the evening. At around 10 o'clock, after Rosalind had fallen asleep, Elena straightened the bedside table that had been knocked out of place while the older woman was sitting on the floor. The handheld recorder lay beneath the table with its back cover open, its light extinguished because the battery had died. Elena picked it up. The house didn't have that type of battery, so she had to go down to the kitchen and search through the drawers, and it was nearly 11 before she managed to replace it. There were 47 recordings on the device. Most were brief fragments, people's names, appointment dates, one recording of Rosalind reciting a cake recipe, and another of her simply singing. Elena listened quickly to each one to see whether anything needed to be copied into the care log. Recording number 29 was 41 seconds long. Wind could be heard in the background, along with the distant sound of pruning shears. Elena listened to the entire recording once, turned it off, sat motionless, then listened to it a second time. Afterward, she removed the earphones, placed the recorder on the table, and remained in the darkness for a very long time. At 7 o'clock the following morning, she used the telephone in the kitchen to call Dr. Adrian Kessler's clinic and asked to speak with him directly, without going through his assistant. She read him the markings stamped on the pill, read the dates from the notebook, and told him the name under which the other prescription had been issued. He was silent for a moment, then asked whether she still had any of the pills. She said she did. He told her that Rosalind absolutely mustn't stop taking them abruptly, because for an elderly patient, suddenly discontinuing that medication could be more dangerous than continuing it. He said he would personally rewrite the treatment plan and gradually reduce the dosage under his supervision. Then he asked whether anyone else in the house knew about this. Elena said no. He asked when he might be able to come without attracting attention. Elena said there was a party at the house on Saturday night and that he was already on the guest list. Kessler said he would arrive an hour early and examine Rosalind before the house became crowded. That afternoon, Elena asked Margaret for 2 hours away from the house to buy sewing thread. She walked to the bus stop, and the gray car was already parked across the street, as though it had always been there. Claire Whitmore opened the door. This time, Elena got in. She didn't speak in circles. She placed the recorder on the dashboard, gave Whitmore the number of the recording, told her the date it had been made, and explained that Rosalind hadn't even realized she had pressed the button. Whitmore picked it up and listened. And throughout those 41 seconds, her expression didn't change at all. When the recording ended, she asked Elena what she wanted. Elena named exactly one thing. Whitmore asked whether she was certain, whether that truly was all she wanted. Elena said yes. Whitmore took out a form, wrote it down, handed it to Elena to read, and Elena signed it. Then she stepped out of the car and walked back to the house. Elena held her tightly, bent down to her ear, and said, "Let's go upstairs. I'll take you." Rosalind didn't move. She released Elena's sleeve, turned away from her, and faced the entire room. In a strong, steady voice, she said that she wanted to say 3 things, and she asked everyone to listen until she had finished, because she might not be able to say them again tomorrow. No one tried to stop her. The first thing, she said, was that she had seen that girl and Mr. Kane standing together in the greenhouse. She couldn't hear what they were saying. She had only seen him brush the girl's hair behind her ear. Rosalind said she couldn't remember the date. She remembered only that the gardener had been pruning the southern rose hedge that day. From the edge of the ballroom, Margaret Hale stepped half a pace forward and said, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, that the groundskeeping log showed the southern rose hedge had been pruned on October 14th. She added that she was the person who approved that log every month. At the far end of the room, Victor Kane's expression didn't change. The second thing, Rosalind said, was that 3 days earlier, that girl had entered her bedroom, closed the door, and told her that if she said another word to her son, she would wake up in Wisconsin the following week. A murmur swept through the room, then died away. Sienna stepped forward, placed a hand on Rosalind's back, and said, "Mother, you're tired." Then she turned to the people nearest her and said, with a voice both sorrowful and patient, that everyone knew about her mother's condition and that she was deeply sorry this had happened tonight, of all nights. Rosalind stepped out from beneath her hand. She said there was a third thing, and she spoke more slowly than she had before. She said that someone had been adding medication to her pill organizer. She said she didn't know what it was and didn't know who had done it. But she knew there were days when her mind was clear and days when it wasn't, and the days when she wasn't lucid always happened to be the days when guests were in the house. Sienna gave a soft laugh and said that this was precisely what the doctor had warned them about. That at this stage, patients often became convinced that someone was trying to harm them. Then she turned to Dante and said, "Please, let's take Mother upstairs." Dante didn't move. The entire room was watching him. He didn't look at Sienna, didn't look at Victor, and didn't look at the guests. He walked 3 steps toward his mother and asked her a single question. "Are you certain?" Then he stood there. He said nothing else. He defended no one and turned to explain nothing to anyone. He simply waited for her answer. And in all 37 years of his life, he had never waited so long for anyone's answer. Rosalind looked directly into her son's eyes and said, "I'm certain." Elena stepped forward. She took the telephone from her apron pocket, opened the photographs, and handed it to him. In a calm, ordinary voice, she said very briefly, "This is the pill organizer photographed on the morning of December 20th. This is Dr. Kessler's prescription containing 4 medications, and this 5th pill isn't among them." Then she swiped to the final photograph and said that the medication had been dispensed to the address of this house under someone else's name, and that the person who signed for it was the night nurse brought in during November. Sienna said she didn't know where Miss Novak had obtained any of that, and that a servant had no right to take photographs inside the house. From the left side of the room, a man of about 55 separated himself from the guests and came forward. Dr. Adrian Kessler took the telephone, held it close to his eyes, examined all 3 photographs, then said that he had been Mrs. Ferraro's physician for the past 3 years and had never prescribed that medication for her. He had also never authorized anyone to add anything to her pill organizer. He added that he had examined her at 5 o'clock that afternoon, before the guests arrived, and that it had been the clearest and most lucid examination she had undergone in 6 months. The room grew so quiet that the air conditioning could be heard. Inside Elena's apron pocket, the small recorder remained exactly where it was. Those 41 seconds would put an end to every argument within a minute. But there were 2 state senators in that room, attorneys representing 3 families, and people for whom hearing the right name was enough to ensure that someone would pay the price the following day. Elena's fingers touched the fabric of her pocket and paused there. Then she lowered her hand and left it resting at her side. Sienna turned to Dante and said that he couldn't allow something like this to ruin tonight, that her parents were standing right there, and that members of the press were waiting outside the gates. Dante looked at her. He said that someone had been telling him the truth for 7 months, and he had been the only person in that house who refused to listen. Then he said there would be no engagement announcement that night. He stepped onto the platform, took the microphone, and addressed the room in exactly 3 sentences. The evening ended there. He thanked everyone for coming. Their cars would be brought around within 10 minutes. No one applauded. Sienna stood in the middle of the ballroom and called after him, her voice still controlled, saying that he was humiliating her in front of all those people because of a senile old woman and a maid. Dante didn't turn around. Elena said nothing. She bent down, picked the tray up from the floor, placed it on the nearest side table, then took Rosalind gently by the elbow and led her out of the ballroom through the side corridor, where no one was standing to watch them. The last car passed through the gates at 11:20. The hired catering staff were stacking chairs, and Elena had just taken Rosalind upstairs, helped her change, and placed the lace handkerchief beside her bed when Margaret called her downstairs. The master of the house wanted to see her in the study. When Elena reached the door of the east wing, Victor Kane was already inside. A thin file lay open on the desk. It contained photographs. One showed her at the bus stop near Green Bay Avenue, standing beside a woman of about 46 who was holding a cup of coffee, with the date printed in the lower corner. Another had been taken through the windshield of a gray car parked across the street, showing Elena on the sidewalk with both hands in her coat pockets. The third had been taken in a parking lot about 100 feet from the stop, with the car door open and Elena getting inside. 3 meetings in 2 months. Victor didn't look at Elena. He told Dante that he had ordered surveillance in November, not because of her, but because there had been reports that federal agents were approaching employees in the family homes. He said he had intended to report it after the engagement party, so he wouldn't ruin the occasion. Then, in a perfectly calm voice, he delivered the final sentence. Tonight, Dante had ended his engagement in front of 120 people to take the side of someone who had privately met with a federal agent 3 times in 2 months. Dante didn't pick up the file. He only looked down at it for a very long time. Then he asked Elena, his voice quiet, whether it was true. Elena looked at the 3 photographs. She thought about that afternoon at the bus stop when she had said she wouldn't accept the business card and then had taken it anyway. She thought about her day off in December, when she had stood outside the car and asked only one question about an elderly woman. She thought about 2 days earlier, when she had truly climbed into the car. She said it was true. She had met the woman 3 times. Victor said nothing more. He didn't need to. Dante asked what she had given the woman. Elena opened her mouth, then stopped. She thought about how, if she revealed those 41 seconds, one more person in this room would know the recording existed, and that person was standing 2 steps away from her. She thought about how, if she said she had asked only for protection for an elderly woman, she would have to prove it, and she had nothing with which to prove it. She looked at the man seated behind the desk, the man who, only an hour earlier, had stood in the middle of the ballroom and waited for his mother's answer, and she said that she couldn't prove something she hadn't done. Then she added very softly that for 7 months, she had stood by and watched a 71-year-old woman beg other people to believe her. And she wouldn't beg for the same thing on her own behalf. She told him to believe whatever was easier for him to believe. The room fell silent. Dante asked no more questions. He picked up the desk telephone, called downstairs, and told Nico to take Miss Novak home, see her all the way there, and make certain she was safe. Then he hung up and told Elena she could go upstairs and collect her things. Elena remained there for another 2 seconds. She intended to tell him that Rosalind was following Dr. Kessler's new treatment plan and would need close observation during the first 3 weeks. But Victor Kane was still standing there, and she understood that anything she said now would become a reason for why she wanted to return. She wished Dante good night and walked out. It took her 7 minutes to pack. She didn't go to the 2nd floor. She left the care log on the kitchen table, opened to the page containing the new treatment plan, and left the tin box of recipe cards exactly where it had always been, on top of the kitchen cabinet. Nico drove her to Union Station. On the way, he asked whether she was all right, and she said she was fine. He didn't ask anything else. She boarded the late train headed toward the city. Back at the house, shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning, Rosalind woke and called for Elena. No one answered. She climbed out of bed, stepped into the hallway, and went looking for her. She opened the door to the 3rd floor room and found the wardrobe empty. People later said that she began screaming, that she pushed Margaret's hands away, and that she kept saying they had taken her away. She refused to sit down. By 2 o'clock, her blood pressure had soared, and she no longer recognized anyone in the room, not even her own son. The ambulance arrived at 2:20 and took her to the hospital in Evanston. Elena received Nico's message after the train had been moving for more than 20 minutes. It contained only a few words, saying that the old woman had been taken to the hospital and that he thought Elena should know. She read it 3 times. She opened her contacts and found Margaret's number, then stopped. She thought about how, if she went back now, everything Victor Kane had just said would become true in the eyes of everyone in that house, and they would have a reason never to allow her near Rosalind again. She thought about how Dr. Kessler had established a new treatment plan and was personally monitoring her, and that at the hospital, at least no one would be adding anything else to her medication. Elena turned off the screen. She sat motionless with her forehead resting against the window, and she didn't go back. In the 3rd floor corridor of Evanston Hospital, Dante Ferraro sat on a molded plastic chair, both elbows braced on his knees. Behind the door, his mother was asleep. No one else remained in the hallway. Over the past 7 months, 2 women had told him the truth. One was lying behind that door. The other had boarded a train. He wanted to go after her that very night, but he knew the storm about to break over his house would destroy anyone standing too close to him. He had to clean his own house first. Rosalind remained in the hospital for 9 days. When she returned home, she walked more slowly than before. Her right hand trembled slightly, and she had to stop and rest halfway up the stairs. But Dr. Kessler had finished adjusting her treatment plan. There were no longer any pills beyond the 4 medications he had prescribed, and the fog had lifted. She remembered the day of the week. She remembered the name of the man who came to repair the furnace. And every morning, when Dante brought up her tray, she asked the same question. Where was the girl? He told her Elena had left. She asked why. He said he couldn't explain it. On Wednesday morning, she handed him her comb, and told him to braid her hair because she could no longer keep her arms raised for very long. Dante Ferraro sat behind his mother for nearly 20 minutes. He managed to separate 3 strands, then tangled them, took them apart and started again. Tangled them once more, and in the end, the braid leaned so far to one side that it came loose the moment he released it. Rosalind looked into the mirror and said that girl had done this in 3 minutes every morning, and she had never once noticed. That afternoon, he went down to the kitchen. The tin box containing the recipe cards was still in its usual place on top of the cabinet. He took it down, found the card for almond ricotta cake, and followed every line exactly. The first batch burned on the bottom. The second didn't rise. He left the third in the oven too long because someone called him. He carried the final plate of cake up to her room and set it down. Rosalind took one bite, chewed, then placed it back on the plate. She told him he didn't need to pretend that no one had just left this house. She said everything in the house tasted like that now. Dante didn't answer. He went down to the study and began doing what he should have done in October. He called his private accountant and ordered a review of every financial transaction connected to Sienna Blake over the previous 18 months. He requested records of every call made from Victor Kane's company telephone. He demanded the employment file and professional license of the night nurse who had resigned in December. Over the next 6 days, the pieces were placed on his desk one by one. On the first day, the accountant reported that 3 months before the engagement party, Sienna had contacted the Ferraro family's law office twice to ask about the structure of joint ownership after marriage, the transfer of shares in 2 transportation companies, and the conditions under which a wife could be granted authority to act on behalf of her husband if he became incapacitated or remained absent for an extended period. On the third day, the call records showed that over 11 months, Victor Kane's telephone and Sienna Blake's telephone had been in contact 247 times, mostly between 10 o'clock at night and 1 o'clock in the morning, and not one of those calls appeared on the work schedule Victor had reported. On the 4th day, the nurse's records revealed that $60,000 had been transferred into her account in 3 installments. The final payment arrived exactly 4 days after she resigned, and the money came from a limited liability company registered in Delaware, whose representative was an attorney who had once worked for the Blake Family Corporation. By the 6th day, the picture was complete enough to see. Once Sienna married Dante, she would gain legal standing within the legitimate assets, and under the clause granting her authority if her husband remained absent for an extended period, she would control the power to sign. Victor, who had stood beside Dante for 15 years and was the only person outside the family permitted inside the East Wing, would take control of everything else, the part that didn't exist on paper. Dante sat there for a very long time with the final truth, the one that took him longest to accept. The extra medication hadn't been added to his mother's pill organizer because they hated her. She was the only person in that house who spent all day beside a window looking out at the garden. She was the only person whose presence in a room went unnoticed. She was a witness, and the cheapest way to silence a witness wasn't to harm her. It was to make certain that no one believed her anymore. They had done it before his eyes for 7 months, and he had helped them every time he opened his calendar and told his mother she had remembered the wrong day. On the 9th day, the family's private attorney brought him another file. He said he had used his connections to obtain a copy of the unsealed portion of the source file from an active federal investigation. He placed it on the desk and told Dante that he should read it himself. Under the list of evidence provided by the source, there was only one entry, one audio file, 41 seconds long, recorded outdoors on October 14th. There was nothing else. No photographs, no documents, no names, no organizational charts, nothing about the harbor, the Union, or the East Wing. Beneath it was a note from the agent in charge, written in dry administrative language, stating that because the recording had been made in the state of Illinois, where the law required the consent of every party, the file couldn't be admitted as evidence in court, and had been used only as a basis for seeking authorization to conduct lawful surveillance of the 2 named subjects. Then, on the final page, there was a record of the agreement with the source. The section listing the source's requests contained 3 blank lines, intended for money, immunity from prosecution, and entry into a relocation program. All 3 had been crossed out. Beneath them, written by hand, was a single sentence, and beside it was the signature Dante had seen 4 days earlier at the bottom of a resignation letter. The source requested only one thing: if Rosalind Ferraro was removed from her home in any manner whatsoever, federal authorities were required to intervene and protect her. There were no other requests. Dante read that line 3 times. Then he placed the file on the desk, leaned back in his chair, and sat motionless in that room until morning. The following morning, Dante Ferraro called his attorney and asked him to arrange a meeting with Special Agent Claire Whitmore, and he went there, carrying everything he had reviewed over the previous 9 days, along with the things that he alone possessed. 6 weeks later, Victor Kane was arrested at a warehouse in Calumet Harbor at 6 o'clock in the morning. There was no struggle. No one was injured. Only 14 federal officers and a warrant. That same day, the Internal Revenue Service and financial investigators searched 4 offices belonging to the Blake Real Estate Corporation, and by the end of the week, the family's name appeared on the front pages of both major Chicago newspapers, beside the words "money laundering investigation." Sienna Blake walked out of her father's office building through a line of cameras without saying a word. Within 3 months, she was formally indicted as an accessory to fraud and elder endangerment, losing her seat on the board, her assets, and every friend who had sat at the head table that night. As for Dante, he signed a cooperation agreement that ran 41 pages. He testified, surrendered every asset derived from illegal activity, dissolved every underground operation his father had left behind, and retained the legitimate businesses under the supervision of a court-appointed monitor. His final sentence was electronically monitored home confinement, reduced under the substantial assistance provision. He wore the device around his ankle throughout that time, and every morning, he braided his mother's hair himself. By the 4th month, the braid finally came out straight. One afternoon in March, he had his attorney take a check to Avondale. Elena invited the man inside, read the amount, then pushed it back across the table. She said her father had worked 3 jobs at once for 4 years and died at the age of 49, and no check could buy back those 15 years. She added that she didn't want to repay her mother's debt with money from the people who had created it. The attorney took the check back with him. 2 weeks later, Margaret Hale came to the door and didn't ask to be invited inside. She said she had worked in that house for 22 years and had seen many things, and she had chosen to call Elena a servant so that she wouldn't have to trouble herself with who Elena truly was. She said she was sorry for standing in that dark hallway that night in October and failing to speak. Elena invited her inside for tea. 14 months passed. Elena returned to school, completed her final year through evening classes, passed her licensing examination, and accepted a position at a memory care center in Evanston, where she supervised the morning shift for 11 residents. She applied to the hospital's financial assistance office, provided proof of her income, and after 4 months of negotiations, most of the debt was forgiven under its policy for low-income patients. She arranged to pay the remainder in monthly installments from her own salary. Tomas transferred to the state university and no longer had to work night shifts. One Thursday afternoon, Dante Ferraro came to the center without flowers, without a ring box, and without anyone accompanying him. He waited in the hallway until her shift ended. He said he had noticed the uniform too soon and the person wearing it too late. He said his mother had chosen Elena back in October, but he had come there that day because he had made his own choice. Elena listened to everything he had to say. Then she stated her conditions one by one, her voice as calm as if she were reading from a care plan. She wouldn't return to work in that house. She wouldn't move in simply because his mother missed her. She earned her own money and would continue to do so. And Rosalind mustn't be made the messenger between 2 adults anymore, because she had already carried enough burdens that other people should have spoken about for themselves. He asked what he was allowed to ask for that day. She said 1 meal, and he wasn't to bring any expectations she hadn't invited. He said he would let the food speak for him. The following Sunday afternoon, they sat on the porch of the house in Lake Forest. The old record player had been brought out from the kitchen, and that song from 1960 played again, its flute still sounding as scratchy as before. Rosalind sat in a wicker chair with the lace shawl draped around her shoulders, and on the table was a plate of almond ricotta cake that, this time, hadn't burned. She took Elena's hand, slipped the wedding ring she had worn for nearly 40 years from her own finger, and placed it in Elena's palm. Elena said she couldn't accept it because it belonged to Rosalind. Rosalind said it belonged to the one who stayed true when everyone else walked away, and that Elena had stayed by her side in all the ways that truly mattered. Then she spoke Elena's full name without getting a single word wrong. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. An elderly person who loses their memory doesn't lose their dignity. And when we stop listening to someone simply because they often forget, we aren't protecting them, we're abandoning them. A person's worth has never rested in the uniform they wear, and the kindest person in a house is often the one who is seen the least. True power isn't the ability to force others into silence, it is the ability to make them brave enough to tell us the truth. And genuine love is always what remains on the days when no one is standing there to watch. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue listening to more compelling stories together every day. How did this story make you feel? And have you ever met someone who was looked down upon because of the work they did, or had an elderly person in your family whose words were no longer taken seriously? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.